Welcome, IT changemakers, to the DEX Show with Tim Flower and Tom McGraw. Let's get into it.
Hello, changemakers. It's another DEX Show for you, and we're Tim and I are here together again, and we're very excited to welcome one of our favorite guests, one of our smartest guests, and the guest from one of our most successful episodes of 2022. Although the episode was actually recorded at the very, very end of 2021, and that's Charles Araujo. Hi, Charles. It's great to see you again, man.
Great to see you, and I feel like a little bit like, you know, I'm on one of those dates with a serial dater where it's like, come on, you tell all the girls that.
No. We don't do second dates too often here on the DEX Show, Charles. It was not only one of our favorite episodes, one of our listeners' favorite episodes. More importantly, one of the most popular of last year. But it was also my favorite episode title, Commodore 64 and a Screwdriver. Obviously, referring, if we recall, to the cocktail, not the mechanical aid. You know. So for all those reasons both. And more, Charles, we have you back on. And listen, if anybody hasn't heard the first of your appearances, you are the publisher for Digital Experience Report. You're an analyst, you're a speaker, you're a best-selling author, and I think always a great way to start a conversation with you, Charles, is to hear about what you're thinking about at the moment. What's your attention focused upon?
So I guess, you know, I'm boring. It's the same stuff. It's this frustration I get. I know we're probably going to talk about it later because we can't help but talk about things like ChatGPT and AI and all the hype and buzz. And you know, our industry is just horrible at this. It's like we go chase the next shiny thing. But if you want to be successful, if you want to actually drive transformation, if you want to actually deliver outcomes, it's almost always about the basics. It's the blocking and tackling. And so I'm still very focused on a lot of the basics. I just published a piece of analysis talking about the fact that why data is so critical, and yet there is a study actually by Salesforce that just got released a couple of days ago that's saying, you know, like some huge percentage of executives totally agree with how important data is, and then how like astronomically small of a percentage of organizations are actually using it in any meaningful way. And you find this across every different spectrum. It's like we get all hyped up about something, but the stuff that we should be doing, the blocking, tackling, the things like organizational design. I mean, I can rant on forever about these, right? The basic stuff that actually delivers results, we just give a lot of lip service to and don't put enough focus on. So I'm still very much focused on the basics, and let's actually get this stuff done once and for all.
Okay, and talking about getting it done, I remember, you know, obviously when we last spoke, middle of the pandemic, even though it was, you know, kind of about to enter the post-pandemic era, I think, fair to say. And there was all this talk of sort of COVID, the transformative effect of COVID. You felt it was a little overstated, maybe for this reason, that, you know, there's a lot of hype and fluff and not enough attending to those basics that you mentioned. I mean, is that where you feel we are today? Has in some way the post-pandemic era been more transformative than the pandemic era, if only because some of the effects of the former have been felt more fully? Or are you still just sort of quite skeptical of there's a lot more talk than action?
I'm sort of middle of the road, both on this. Being an old consultant, it depends. You know, I think the challenge around this is that on the one hand, any change, right, takes a long time, and that was what I was bristling at when people were making these big grandiose statements about, you know, more transformation in 3 months than we saw in 10 years. Not really, right? That was surface level stuff, and so I think we're seeing that the actual transformative process happens very slowly. It requires deliberation. It requires focus. And that is happening. Now, what I do think is interesting is, and this is the part of that story I agree with, is that there has been more significant movement in the last, say, 12 to 18 months of people being fully prepared to make much more significant change. the challenge, I mean, going back to this whole data thing, just because it's top of mind for me, is that the foundation of what it takes to make that change is still hard and will always be hard. I'm working on another, I'm calling them deep dives now, right? But the sort of deeper analysis focused on some of the challenges around, the gains or the lack of gains in automation that we're starting to see now. And that a lot of that is that what we're running into is that the what is necessary to sort of get the same gains that we used to get by simply applying any technology to drive efficiency, well, all the low-hanging fruit's been picked. And so now we need to start dealing with the big, hairy problems, the cross-functional, end-to-end process gaps, and that's why things like process mining are becoming such a huge deal now. And that's hard. That's really, really hard to do from not only a technology perspective, but from the organizational change and the behavioral change that's necessary to do that. So the good news is I think we're starting to have the conversations. I think I feel like when I'm talking to folks now, we're past that hype that, oh my gosh, all this stuff. And they're starting to get to the real change that is starting to take effect. But it's always, and I'm not a big fan of most of the stuff that Gartner does, but the hype cycle was probably one of the most, dead on analyses of how things go. And we see that play out over and over and over again. And so I think we're in that right now, right? Where a lot of these things that got super hyped up during the pandemic, we're approaching that trough of despair or whatever it's called, right? Where we all sort of forget about it, and that's when all the real change starts to happen. The one I am watching of all of that, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead, I don't remember, but that I am watching very carefully is the whole remote work with the return to office thing and the dynamics changing there. We'll see. I may have been wrong on that one as far as I thought that we were going to see a stall, but this was the tipping point to a lasting change. And the threat of the recession has caused a massive turn back where employees have lost a little bit of their leverage, and organizations right now are putting pretty deep stakes in the ground saying, hey, you need to get back to the office. So we'll see if this is the last gasp or if this represents a miss in terms of we're not going to see a bigger shift. We'll see.
Totally, yeah. We had Jacob Morgan on the show very recently, and he was saying that the pendulum is swinging back towards employers, or that it's swung too far in favor of employees. And one of the things that's important for everybody concerned, that we have a kind of a united front and a kind of a proper relationship fundamentally between employers and employees, is that we have a common workspace and workplace. It's an opinion a lot of people have. It's one I find difficult to relate to myself, since I work for an international company and have been working around from home for years and feel quite connected simultaneously to it. I mean, what's your view in general of that employee power dynamic, Charles?
Well, so I think we should differentiate between three different things here. One is exactly that. There's a power dynamic, the leverage. Who has the leverage to dictate the terms of the relationship, the employee or the employer? For arguably the last decade, it's been the employee, particularly in tech companies, particularly in anything where we were looking at these highly skilled workers that were in limited supply. The employee was in control. So there's no question that the power dynamic, the leverage has shifted across the board. And we can talk more about that in a second. But I think it's important not to lump everything together. There's two other. There's the element of employee productivity, collaboration, innovation. And then there's the idea of the employee experience. And all three of those need to be looked at distinctly. So my opinions on the last two haven't changed at all, right? That the driver of productivity and innovation in some cases is going to be benefited by in-place work, but most of the time it's not. There's plenty of good data now that shows that people are actually more creative, more innovative when they're working independently, have the opportunity to come together to collaborate in very specific moments of the creative process and the creation process. And there's plenty of evidence that shows that we actually we see losses in productivity with people in the office because of all the water cooler stuff. And so I think there's cases. I'm a huge fan of hoteling. I'm a huge fan of organizations having an office space to allow people to come together. But I think this is this is a power dynamic play that people want to exert. The executives want to exert control, and that's all this is. And then the last element of this, the employee experience, I think is critical because despite all the purported layoffs, and I don't want to say that's like obviously the layoffs are happening, but I think people have made it a much bigger deal than it actually is from a macroeconomic standpoint. The reality is that if you are in a competitive space, you are still competing for employees, and employees are still choosing to work with organizations who are delivering a better, cohesive employee experience because they're able to get more done, they're more productive, they have a more enjoyable process, and that is better for them from a career standpoint, because that then leads to better outcomes that they can tout on their resume, and it ultimately is a great indicator of a successful company. So if I look at these three things, there's no question the power dynamic has shifted. I don't think the fundamentals of the other two have shifted at all. And then my last little comment on the power dynamics is there's a really fascinating article that came out a couple of weeks ago from Fast Company that talked about the fact that even all these layoffs, it's fast follower stuff. It's groupthink. That there's this really interesting number that the average is like they're almost all right at 6%. And 6% is the number that the street, I mean Wall Street, investors say, oh, they're cutting the fat, that's great. And employees, it's not a deep enough cut that they're freaking out and running for the hills. And so it's like this carefully calibrated hit that these large tech companies are having to do just to sort of strike this balance. But it's not based on any fundamentals where there's weakness in the market or anything. So it's a very interesting sort of space, and I think people are mostly reading too much into sort of what's happened.
So, Charles, let's touch a little bit on that employee experience. We just recorded an episode that talked specifically about how an employee experience capability benefits enterprise IT, and specifically the enterprise IT help desk. But many enterprises have a customer-facing help desk as well. And when they have a poor experience, it translates into bad consumer experience. Think about when you call your cell phone provider or your cable company or your insurance carrier and their PC has to reboot, or a blue screen's in the middle of the phone call. It impacts that customer experience. Where do you feel that kind of the dynamic between employee experience and customer experience, where does that sit now in 2023? Is there really an appreciation in large enterprise, and is that increasing or is it decreasing?
So again, I think it's really important to segregate perception from reality, or the fact from the way people see it. The fact is, again, the fundamentals, in my opinion, are undeniable. You can prove it with data. You can prove it anecdotally. I tell a story of my father several years ago, and I won't name them, but a large cell phone provider, and he had some minor issue, whatever it was. I forgot what it was. He had to go try to return something, and he went in there, and the employee was super helpful, super friendly, super engaged, all the things you'd want to deliver a great customer experience. Mm-hmm. Could not make the system on the back end do what needed to be done to solve my father's problem. Finally had to say, I think this is because you bought it at this other store. You need to go there. So now my dad gets in a car, drives 15 minutes to the other store, gets there. That guy still can't figure out. Finally does the right thing and says, you know what, here you go. Here's this thing that you need to just forget about it. I'll deal with it on the back end. But this was in a point of where a bad employee experience was very directly creating a horrible customer experience, even when all of that expensive customer service and customer experience training they invested in paid off. These guys were doing all the right things, and their systems were in their way. And I have countless stories that executives have shared with me about these sorts of things. So to me, it's undeniable, the relationship between the employee experience and the customer experience. What I do think we're seeing right now, though, is because that relationship is still hard to quantify, it's hard to make these very direct connections for a whole bunch of reasons. Executives were always sort of suspect, always sort of like, okay, I get it, it makes sense, but is it going to rise to the top of my investment plan or investment portfolio? And I think with this leverage shift that we talked about, it's actually become harder, even if somebody wants to justify it, harder to do so, right? Because the argument used to be, hey, we need to go compete with these employees. They've got all this leverage, and now that argument's fallen away. So now the only way you can really make these claims is by directly connecting to that customer outcome. And as we've shown, that's hard to do. Not impossible, but it takes a lot more work, and it's where tools like yours help, right? You start getting data. What we need is data around all of it. But it is definitely a challenge, and I think as a result, we've seen certainly a lot less interest in the employee experience side of things.
Yeah, there's this concept that there's, I think it was a 10x difference in the aversion to losing revenue or losing benefit versus the excitement of gaining revenue or gaining benefits. So for every dollar you would gain, you have a 10x aversion to losing revenue. So it's maybe that's a concept that we need to push on a little bit more. But let's talk a little bit about kind of the other parts of employee experience, and specifically things that touch on the IT folks. And I know you've been interested for a long time in the impact of automation and AI. ChatGPT is on the tip of everyone's tongues right now. It really took off at its launch. What are your thoughts on ChatGPT and how it's been received? Is it a game changer, or is it not as big a deal as everyone is making it out to be?
Oh gosh. So I'm working on another deep dive on this particular topic, and I'm really struggling because I generally don't weigh in on these hyper trendy topics because there's so much ink being spilled on it. But I'm a contrarian on this. I've talked to a couple executives who, like IT executives, who are all in on it, who think it's fabulous, and I think it has its uses. Particularly with like closed data sets, like if I'm going to feed it a meeting notes and say summarize this, it's going to do a pretty good job with that. There are use cases where it makes sense. I've got 2, maybe 3 major issues with the whole generative AI space, and I guess I should be more specific. Specifically with large learning model based generative AI, that the fundamental way it works is it has zero context. It has no understanding, what some people in the AI community call the semantic layer, no understanding of the underlying concepts. It is literally just putting words together. And because those language models are so high, it does a pretty dang good job of guessing what that next word is. But because it's missing that contextual layer, we have absolutely no way to validate its veracity. And the only way to validate it is by somebody actually looking at that output and making sense of it and saying this is correct or not. So I think it has uses. Like if I'm taking a lot of big text, I need to summarize it, and then someone's going to do a proof layer to go and read it. So yep, that makes sense. I think it has its place, and so the places that I've heard executives starting to experiment with it, that's sort of the use case. I think the broader implications about it, or the broader use cases of it, I think if I'm an enterprise executive and I was like diving into it, you'd be making a big mistake. You're opening yourself up to a ton of risk. And you're seeing that already with a lot of the major organizations sort of quietly on the back end saying, do not use ChatGPT for anything that is, actually important. So I think that it is overblown from that standpoint. I also think it has a potential negative consequence in 2 ways. One is that it's sort of like when Alexa and Siri first came out. That initial reaction was so positive and everyone got so excited that it actually set the expectation bar so high that nothing could actually live up to it, including those products. Right. And so now we're seeing, right? I mean, Alexa's losing a ton of money right on their side because they're not seeing the pull-through that everyone sort of expected from this. And that's because it's proving to be not nearly as useful as everyone thought at that first blush. And I think it's going to be the same thing. So now suddenly there's a whole bunch of really good organizations out there doing conversational AI that do have a contextual layer, that do provide reliable, verifiable data on the back end. And but what they don't have is this super clean interface from the language learning models, where they're not going to appear to be as intuitive, right? As someone, I need to find out who said this, but they said ChatGPT is basically mansplaining as a service, right? Has no idea what it's talking about, but it says it with complete conviction. And the problem is that if you're going to have a conversational AI platform that is in fact rooted in defensible data, it can't be that effective, right? And so I think it actually runs the risk of taking some really solid technologies and people like poo-pooing them. It's like, oh, wait a minute, why isn't it as good as ChatGPT on this conversational side? And that's going to create an expectation gap that is unfortunate. And I think that is the second problem, is it extends more broadly. There's some amazing uses of AI being applied and deployed across all spectrums of the enterprise right now. And they're all going to sort of pale in comparison in terms of that whiz-bang factor, but they are in fact much more impactful on a real basis of how you can apply them to things. If you look at some of the leaders in the AI ops space, right, of how they're using this technology to truly do amazing stuff of dealing with alert storms and all of these different applications. And people are going to sort of, again, I think they may pale in comparison to this they can't live up to that hype. And so they may actually, it could go the other way. It could be that this opens up this whole door of people really excited about AI, but I fear that it's going to have the opposite effect. So I'm a bit of a contrarian. I'm fairly bullish over the long haul on how this technology gets applied, fairly bearish in the short term.
And even outside of enterprise IT, where I am interested to see where it goes is, say, for instance, something like NextThink takes employee sentiment and device data to get better insights and context. I'm wondering when a company like Boston Dynamics with their robotic dog starts to use device metrics and context of the environment along with input to be able to tell that dog in AI terms how to respond and get better context and more insight into how that robot is actually interfacing and reacting with the environment.
Yeah, no, and look, I think you're sort of making my point in that there is some amazing stuff that can happen as we start applying this technology. I mean, at the end of the day, all AI is effectively pattern matching. I mean, that's how our brain works. We're big giant pattern matchers. So there's tremendous potential in all of that. But what you realize is that once you actually require it to be defensively accurate, this becomes inordinately more difficult, right? It's why, we had massive predictions about, for instance, using AI to do early detection of things like radiology scans. And the technology is coming along, but this explosion where people thought it was going to just replace radiologists almost overnight hasn't proven to be true, because that need for it to be accurate requires that contextual layer where we can defend it, and that is incredibly difficult, right? ChatGPT had this great advantage. It doesn't have to be right. They're just going to throw it out there. And so the use cases that we're seeing, somebody just wrote this that I thought was dead on. It's like, when you're using ChatGPT for a creative endeavor, all day long, because you're not relying on that. You're using it as an idea generator or as a starter for something you're working on or whatever. I think it's fabulous in that use case. But people are immediately starting to go to, I could just ask it whatever, and it's going to give it. And we'll see. I think I'm somewhat excited that Microsoft deployed it as part of Bing, because I think it's going to be a great test. And I do appreciate the way they're using it, meaning they are using the language model as the front end and back end layer, meaning they're using it to simply do the intent recognition and to then give it a cohesive response, but they're connecting it to this other data. So I think that sort of a model, that sort of application makes a lot of sense. But we're still in the very, very early days. So if I'm advising anybody on this, it's like, take a breath and, have a good, healthy dose of skepticism around it.
And you touched on it a little bit there, but in terms of automation, in my experience, IT executives, not in all, but in many instances, think about automation as the easy button, right? I'll automate it. I won't have to have my people do it. It'll do it quickly and just go deploy it. What do you think about specific advances in workplace automation? Where do you think we could see some comparable impact there?
So I'm actually super excited about where this is going from a couple of perspectives. The first, I mentioned I'm working on this new report, and I forgot the title of it, but it's like the 3 reasons that your automation efforts are stalling. And the fundamental crux of it is, like I mentioned, that the gains of the future, the gains that we're going to be seeing, because you're right, that easy button is gone, right? It doesn't work anymore. It broke. We used it too many times. Those gains are going to be found in looking at these cross-functional business processes, these things that go end-to-end within an organization, hitting multiple functional units. Because in the past, we focused our automation efforts in these very targeted functional tasks. Right. And if you look at the early days around automation, whether that was enablement of human automation or actual like RPA type automation, it was done the exact same way, right? RPA came out of this very narrow focus of let's do one thing and automate it. And there too, across any of those different spectrums, whether we're looking at workflow automation tools or RPA or whatever, same thing, that they're sort of running out of the runway because all the simple stuff is being handled. And now we're seeing that the real gains are how do you connect this across multiple dots? Mm-hmm. And this is where AI can do a great job of helping with that, as well as tooling that simply makes it easier for organizations to do that, right? To look across functions and to go end to end. And so you put these two together, and I think we're going to see a massive explosion. I mean, so a handful of people are starting to say, hey, guys, what is ChatGPT or what is AI really all about? It's about making people more productive in their jobs, taking away all of the stuff that is makes them inefficient and is wasteful and allows them to focus on these more creative tasks. That's what we're going to see here, I think. And I think so many of our traditional back-end business processes are ripe for this. They're still highly inefficient, particularly in those handoffs. And I think there's just a tremendous opportunity. So I think we're going to see this sort of golden age of taking automation into this real end-to-end kind of domain, right? If this report I'm talking about, going back to the days of process reengineering, and they failed for a lot of reasons. If you're old like me and remember the 90s when we tried to do these big giant projects, but one of the reasons was that they were just so complex that you couldn't possibly develop or leverage technology effectively. They became these $100 million, sometimes $1 billion projects that took years and years to complete. And in this day and age, by the time you get even close to being done, before you're even halfway done, everything has changed. And so I think we're in this tremendous period where the technology is sort of caught up with the need. So I'm very excited to see where this all goes.
Amazing stuff, Charles. Just wonderful to have you back on the show. Wonderful to listen to your thoughts again. Wonderful to get your updates on the, I think, very eventful 12, 15 months that have passed since we last spoke. So treat for us, treat for our listeners. And we will, of course, point people to your wonderful website where they can find your writing. And look, in terms of the ChatGPT conversation, it keeps arising again and again. You brought a really fresh perspective to it, but we will also link in the show notes to some of the recent articles and discussions we've had on this show and elsewhere around it. So look, just remains for me to say, lovely to see you again, Charles. Hope to see you for a third date sometime in the future. And look, you have a great rest of the year in the meantime.
Thanks. Great being with you all.
Great to see you, Charles.
Pleasure.
To make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to leave a rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. If you'd like to learn more about how NextThink can help you improve your digital employee experience, head over to nextthink.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.